Thank you all for joining us for the next session in our AI Summit. I'm Erin, an engineer by background and current investor at Index, focused on AI, data applications, and infrastructure. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by three incredible leaders to discuss practical applications of AI. To start, would love it if you could all share a bit about your background, what got you into this space. Alex, why don't you start us off?
Hey everyone, I'm Alex. I'm the CEO and founder of Scale AI. We are an infrastructure company for AI. We build tools and products and infrastructure that allow other companies to build incredible things with AI. So we're incredibly excited to talk about practical applications of AI because we see them every single day with each one of our customers. In terms of how I personally got started into AI and into what Scale does, I was actually studying AI and machine learning at MIT. Before I started Scale, I was kind of the phase, I often think about it as the phase when it was clear that AI was intellectually very interesting. And it was even, AI has always been very intellectually interesting, as we know from like sort of sci-fi and all these sort of like doomsday scenarios of AI. So the thought that you can have these algorithms that can sort of simulate or do things that traditionally we thought only humans can do is obviously very intellectually interesting, but it's kind of before a lot of the economics impacts of AI and machine learning. It was really, for example, in the very early days of deep learning. And so I was studying at AI and machine learning at MIT. I kind of felt like, hey, it feels like AI is going to have this huge impact in the world. And so I built a side project. I tried to build a camera inside my fridge that would tell me when my roommates were taking my food. And I very quickly, I was working on this for maybe like 2 hours, and I realized, there's no way that I'm going to be able to solve the data problem to be able to actually build this thing, which kind of led to Scale and sort of this insight that, data is the new code, that you need huge amounts of data. If you think about what separates a good and bad algorithm, it really is all the data that separates the performance, not necessarily the code. And so that inspired me to start Scale. Scale, we've grown now to a almost 500-person company based here in San Francisco, and we help all sorts of industries from automotive companies to big tech companies to retail and e-commerce companies to the U.S. government and everything in between.
Any smart fridge companies?
Actually, it's funny that you mentioned that. Well, I sat down with the guy who runs Amazon Go the other day, the sort of just walk out grocery store, which is the exact same problem, the exact same technical problem. And he said they needed a ton of data, in fact. So
love it. Marty, how about you?
Well, I would describe my story as if you live long enough, you get to be considered a pioneer. And what I mean by that is that I had a dream, really a fantasy, back in the 80s when I was a master's student at Harvard, MIT, and then later a grad student at Stanford, of automating medical diagnosis. And many people share that dream. That was a dream that was out there at the time. Could you just put in all the symptoms and manifestations, and then out comes the probability ranked differential diagnosis? How hard can that possibly be? Well, it didn't take long at this program called Artificial Intelligence in Medicine, Summick's AIM, for us to figure out that if there are 1,000 diseases in general internal medicine and 10,000 manifestations, that calculating that probability distribution is a calculation whose complexity is on the order of 1,000 to the 10,000. And the compute power was just way, way too low. And so that propels the rest of my story. Realizing that the compute power was too low to do anything, I heeded the siren call to do anything in medicine. I heeded the siren call of Wall Street, which had problems they were prepared to pay to solve, and were pressing problems, and were way, way easier problems. And so what started off as what I thought was a 2-year pay off my student debt ended up at 26 years at Goldman Sachs. And we didn't use AI or anything resembling it for almost all of that 26 years. But in the last few years, it got really interesting. After, and I'll talk, I imagine, in this discussion about some of those examples of nonlinear pattern analysis, otherwise known as machine learning or AI, in finance. And then when I retired from Goldman Sachs, I went back to my roots in the life sciences. And I found that while I've been doing this tour away on Wall Street, 26 years was 13 or so, maybe 15 generations of Moore's Law. And the computers were now into the second half of the chessboard. And you could do all kinds of interesting things that like AI-enabled drug discovery. People would have laughed if you had mentioned that in the 80s, right? There's 10,000 trillion organic compounds and only 4,000 approved drugs in the world. Like, how are you going to go through that search space? Well, now it turns out that you can. So these are exciting times.
Well, compute and Moore's Law is a great transition to you, Anima. Would love to hear, what brought you here.
Yeah, hi, Anima Anandkumar. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a professor at Caltech as well as director of AI research at NVIDIA. And, ever since like high school days, right, when I first started learning about probability and that there is a mathematical foundation for inherently random and uncertain things in the world, right? It's such a different thinking from like having deterministic, laws of physics, Newton's laws, and studying equations, to reasoning about uncertainty. And I think that kind of was like, oh, wow, I can finally make sense of all the crazy, uncertain things in the world to some extent. And so, during my undergrad and grad school, I was looking into statistical signal processing in the context of what we now call the edge AI or Internet of Things, right? Like kind of small devices, if they have to transmit, they have limited power, what valuable information should they be transmitting? And how do they collaborate in a distributed manner to derive insights to see if there are anomalies? So again, I think it's that mathematical foundation that made it very fascinating for me to get started on this very hard problem. And back, a decade ago, there wasn't still all the hardware platforms, right? Like what we see with the NVIDIA Jetsons available. So I moved to thinking about the big data problems in the context of extracting hidden variables. All these problems are inherently about, seeing the unseen, right? So, if you think about the underlying communities in social networks. You may have some cues in terms of metadata, but people connect in such interesting ways that that's not a labeled phenomena, right? You may not be able to pinpoint what different communities they belong to. Or look at categorizing news articles, right? You could say, what is the list of topics? It need not be one topic. It could cover a whole range of topics in a single article. So it's kind of that richness of latent variables that got me very fascinated. And what we saw was looking at tensors as a multi-dimensional object that can incorporate these kind of relationship between multiple variables together, right? Like for instance, how words co-occur in a document. If a group of words are occurring commonly, you could kind of treat that as specifying a certain topic, right? So, but how do we do that at a large scale was one of the methods I invented, using tensor methods to extract topics automatically. And then when we come to the era of deep learning, we see what I call the trinity of data, right? As both Alex and Martin mentioned, lots of data available, lots of compute with the end of Moore's law and the GPU acceleration, right? Having now the availability of very fast parallel primitives and the flexibility of neural networks coming together. And with that, there is just so much to work on, right? So some of the latest things I've been excited about is in the realm of AI for science, like what Martin mentioned on AI-enabled drug discovery. We are able to show quantum mechanical level calculations, really precise calculations, but be thousands of times faster than the numerical methods and be much more accurate in the search for better drugs, better targeted discovery of certain properties, but also other phenomena like weather and climate. Climate change is perhaps the most pressing problems humanity is facing today. So how about being able to have sharp uncertainty estimates along with good predictions, and doing that really fast? Because if we back of the envelope calculation shows that if we need to get all the way down to 1 kilometer resolution, spatial resolution, and fast forward just even 10 years, right? So really high resolution, precise measurements, it would take more than 10 to the 11 more compute than what we have today. So, so we have lots of compute, but it's nowhere enough when we want to solve all these hard problems, whether it's weather modeling or drug discovery. And that's where AI can really give us this million X leap forward in many of the domains. And that's exciting.
Super exciting. So yeah, maybe kicking it off, I think we're all sort of realizing that we're on the tip of what is a pretty large transformation in the world, with AI being, real and practical and coming into our businesses. I'm curious, how is AI adoption today starting to change business models for classical enterprises? And maybe, Marty, I'll kick this one over to you, having spent a long time in what I would consider a classical enterprise, to share your thoughts on that journey.
It's a classic enterprise for sure. And what I would say, the most important observation, and this is one that everybody is aware of now, but it's super important, is, as we've said, you need the data first. And so something that really positioned Goldman Sachs, where I spent most of my career, beautifully for this, was something that we started doing in the early 90s, where we had a philosophy that we like all time series. We never stop and ask, is this a time series worth keeping? But whenever you become aware of a time series, not only do you become aware of it, you gather it, and then you put in place a process to clean it and curate it and name it to the extent that you can, which is very hard in finance. There are millions of time series. So we started doing this in the early 90s, and we were doing it assiduously. And then, as various regulatory events happened, there was predictably in the classic enterprise a lot of grumbling. Oh, now we have to gather this data set for the regulators as well and report on it. And we actually turned that into a huge advantage. We discovered again and again that being required by the regulators to gather these time series, we just embraced it as, okay, it's just another time series. And those time series turned out to be gold mines of information. So to take a particular example, all banks are engaged in maturity transformation, just a long-winded way of saying that on the one side, the customers can take their deposits out at any moment. And then on the other side, you're lending it out for 30 years. And that's a very big mismatch. And to manage that mismatch, you need to have liquidity buffers. In the case of very large firms, such as Goldman Sachs, those liquidity buffers are $200 billion plus of just cash at the Fed in a slush fund. And that is expensive to have that kind of cash. That can be 20% of your balance sheet in cash earning nothing. And so there's an incredible optimization problem there. What is the right amount of liquidity to have? On most days, you don't need that much. And then a pandemic happens and you need a lot. But you can't wait until the pandemic has already happened to go raise the liquidity. You had to have it before. So it's really circular and it's really nonlinear. Having all of these data sets lovingly curated turned out to be a superpower. And when we let loose a whole range of machine learning techniques on all this data we had, suddenly we had this unbelievable tool to know not just how much liquidity should we have today, but how much liquidity should we have a year from now, or 3 years from now, or 5 years from now? It's not as complicated as the weather, but it's getting up there, and it takes a lot of compute to do this. And so I think a failure mode, to conclude, for classic enterprises, which we've also seen, is let's go get some ML scientists and then sprinkle them, or we'll have a center of excellence of some ML scientists, and they'll do something amazing, and then we'll pour it on top of the old company as some kind of overlay. I just would never recommend that, and I can't imagine that ever working, and I've never seen it working. Instead, you have to have a data-driven, algorithmic problem-solving mindset embedded in your culture, where you never met a data series that you didn't like, and you keep it all, and then you do something with it.
That's a really interesting point that you make about kind of how you think about structuring in large organizations, your data teams. Because I do think, on the one hand, I think you're exactly right. And that's a big failure mode that we've seen again and again with companies, that they have this sort of like off the beaten path in a little dark corner, making up their own problems for themselves, R&D teams, rather than being accountable to business outcomes. But at the same time, I think enterprises, as we've seen over the last 5 years, have been responsible for a lot of really important developments in the space of R&D. So I'm also curious, like, how do you think about how should enterprises balance research activity with practical applications? Like, what successful models have you seen for how to structure kind of internal AI and machine learning efforts so that you're both kind of pushing the industry forward and kind of making meaningful business outcomes? Maybe Anima, since you all do so much research over there, I'd be curious to hear your perspective for how you balance this.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think, what makes NVIDIA such a great and unique company is like that, being so agile and dynamic, right? While also doing like deep work that, we are publishing, we are like talking about it. At the same time, we are looking at, how to make this practical and how do we engineer this at scale and how does it lie in the ecosystem that we have, right? Because NVIDIA is no longer just about the hardware, but the entire computing platform, right? So CUDA is the basis, but on top of it, what are the platforms? What comes to healthcare, we have Clara, right? Everything from medical imaging to genomic analysis to drug discovery, all these like kind of models that are pre-trained and available, or enabling like the constraints of the platforms such as federated learning. One thing I'm very proud of is how in the beginning of the pandemic, 20 hospitals used federated learning in our platform, and within 20 days had an AI model for patient care, right? That was one of the first AI models that was there, and really kind of helped drive some sense into this fairly senseless pandemic, at least in the beginning. So I think, to me, like understanding the constraints of each domain and building an ecosystem and a platform is so important. And so research is such an important component of this, because as we speak, these are all really still unsolved problems, right? I mean, how do we do federated learning at scale, thinking about differential privacy, for instance, as a metric, or other kinds of membership attacks or other, constraints on privacy that we want to incorporate, right? So there is algorithmic research, but at the same time, having hospitals as partners and having real world data and engineering at scale to showcase how these efforts can pay off. I think, we need both sides of the coin. And that's what we've seen in every domain, from like kind of computer vision to language models. We have large scale language models. We have the 530 billion language model that we recently trained. And now we are looking into, what are the toxicity in these models, right? How can we minimize that? How can we do like few short instructions efficiently at such large scale models? And these are black boxes. So how do we better understand their functionality and have a diverse set of use cases that are easy for even a non-expert to easily define what they want out of these models? So I think that's where there is room for like kind of doing open-ended research, publishing it, also like kind of talking about the downsides and the dangers of these models, right? That freedom is so important. But we wouldn't be able to do it unless we engineer this large scale model and we have the frameworks that can handle data and model parallel training at scale and having the compute ability to do this on thousands of GPUs. So all these are examples where, right, it's really a one team philosophy. That's what Jensen believes in, having us kind of have a seamless collaboration rather than as separate silos.
Yeah, actually, on that point, I think what you made about how do you think about tying research activities to a set of real world use cases or real world data? Alex, I'm curious because you guys have pushed the field further as well. How do you manage that?
Yeah, no, I think so if you take a big step back and you think about AI and its potential impacts on traditional industries, which is obviously one of the things that as a community we're all really excited about. One way to think about what's happened already is that a lot of the early use cases of AI, the first use cases of large scale machine learning were in ads technology, or more or less these like fully digital technology companies. So that like the Googles and the Facebooks were the first companies to adopt large scale machine learning techniques, and then as those shifted towards deep learning, they were the first to adopt deep learning in a large scale way to actually generate a lot of business value. And a lot of that is because conceptually these businesses, Google and Facebook, were constrained to they were purely digitally constrained. So everything that those businesses were doing, more or less, were done with a computer only. And then what that allowed is, like, now that you had AI and machine learning, which is a strict improvement of capability, a strictly better set of capabilities for a machine, then all of a sudden they could use it and generate all this value within their business. And that's one of the reasons they've transformed the quickest. Then if you compare that to traditional enterprises or most traditional companies, there's this, like, they're very operation intensive. They have this mix of this small sliver of things that are digital, but most things which are done with people in the real world. And part of the challenge, if you're to think about like, why is it that AI has not had any impact on these enterprise organizations? Part of the challenge has been that you can't just sub in AI and expect it to perform better than people in all these contexts. It's not strictly better than people in almost any context. Like, you do not have algorithms that perform strictly better than a human would in most situations. And so you need to totally redesign what you're doing and how you solve these problems, and totally redesign the operational processes to be able to adapt to using a machine learning algorithm or using AI. So that was a big diatribe, but getting to, like, the reason this is relevant for your point is, like, how do you integrate the conceptual thinking around real world data, real world applications of AI with research outcomes? Research outcomes are about showing theoretical improvements to performance. So it's like in a somewhat constrained environment or somewhat constrained setup, do you have algorithms that perform at a higher performance, which is great. But a lot of when you think about applying AI with real world data to real world situations, so much of that is not only the thinking about the algorithm and what's the data in the algorithm that fuels this, like, incredible algorithm. Of course, it's about the operational redesign that will allow the algorithm to be productive and impactful for the business process. And so I think all of this goes to say, which is that, like, I think I think a lot of people think about, like, sprinkling, going back to Marty's point, like, you, like, sprinkle AI on things that you do, and then all of a sudden they're going to be better. No, you don't sprinkle AI. You kind of have to like perform surgery on what you're doing, and then, like, implant AI deep into the guts of what you're building. And that's the only way that you're going to actually get real business outcomes. So I think, now, final point, the thing that is really underrated, I think, when it comes to AI are, I don't know if you call it product people or product engineers or product managers or operations folks, folks who are willing and able to get in and perform that surgery in a way that's very cross-functional is, like, incredibly important. Like, that's really what's at a premium right now with where we're at in AI transformation.
I love the way you put that as surgery, because having before I became an investor, I was at Palantir for a long time and spent a long time doing those surgeries. So I resonate with that description. I guess this brings me to, like, when we think about the industries that are sort of ripe for this sort of surgical intervention based on some of the innovations of the last few years, which have been astounding. In what sectors do you think AI is sort of poised to make an outsized impact? Like, when you think about, certain types of businesses? Which ones will be the most unrecognizable thanks to AI? And maybe on the converse of that, like, what do you think is a bit overhyped, where, you know, maybe we're not quite ready for AI to completely transform the way they work? Marty, I'll kick this one over to you.
Well, I'll start off with something. I don't know if I'd say overhyped. I don't expect AI to transform the world of financial services into a form that's unrecognizable. Now, there are some hugely difficult problems in financial services: fraud detection, know your client, anti-money laundering. And I do expect AI radically to improve the quality of those processes. And we will notice that, and that will be a good thing for the planet. But I don't know that that would make the business unrecognizable, but it's super important. It's an accelerant and it's a competitive advantage. And if, on the flip side, if you don't do it, you'll be out of business. But the industry I really want to talk about, and here I'm just entirely talking my own book because most of my investments are in healthcare and life sciences, and I'm chairman of the board of Recursion Pharmaceuticals, is pharmaceuticals. This is an industry, I don't know, maybe in med school, it was my best subject. I absolutely loved pharmacology. I won't say anything more about that, but it was an amazing topic for me, and I adored it. And I always wanted to do something about pharmaceuticals because of this problem of 10,000 trillion organic compounds, and why are there only 4,000 approved drugs globally? And that number is just very slowly increasing. And this is an area that I think is particularly fascinating. And I will just talk about the company that I know the best, which is Recursion, where Recursion is doing pioneering work in machine learning. There's no question about it. But the techniques that Recursion is using are also being used elsewhere. And there's probably some extreme cutting edge state of the art and there is definitively in machine learning that Recursion will get to later. But here's something that Recursion is doing right now that, to my mind, is essential, which is it's building robots, and the robots grow dozens of human cell lines in culture, and then the robots systematically perturb those cells. So let's start with number 1 of 30,000 genes and knock it out. Then let's knock out gene number 2. Then let's knock out gene number 1 and gene 2, gene 1 and gene 3. You get the idea. Do every possible permutation of knockouts. This is a large number with 30,000 genes. And then on top of that, start throwing every possible small molecule and also knocking out genes. And then image the cells robotically, and the cells will be disrupted and their organelles will look different under imaging. And then apply machine learning to those images as a way to actually decode the underlying metabolic and biological process, not the ones we learned in 8th grade biology, but the incredibly complicated nonlinear system that is actually happening. And so that you can start to identify drugs that way and prune the drug discovery space. And so it's this coupling of state-of-the-art numerical and algorithmic techniques with vast amounts of data that are being produced in a highly replicable, reliable, incredibly automated way. And that combination is just unbelievably powerful. And in an industry, I don't know the latest figure, 20% of US GDP, something like that. And the US largely paying for most pharmaceutical development globally, that's an industry that is in some very urgent need of transformation. And it's happening right now in front of us. I'm super excited about it, as you can tell.
Well, what I loved the way you described it is it felt like almost a little factory line. Like it felt super operational. Like it wasn't just, I'm going to deploy this model, but I need to actually build this process with all these components and think about how they fit together, which kind of, brings me back to Alex, what, how you were thinking about the way that AI actually gets adopted in the enterprise. So I'm curious then, maybe Alex, I'll kick you the same question. Where do you think AI has the most potential for outsized impact?
Yeah, no, it's a super good question. There's a few ways to think about this. I think one is, per my previous analogy around surgery, I think it's heavily dependent. Basically, the areas where AI will be adopted the most quickly are the areas where the surgery is the least severe, where you sort of like the lightest weight surgery that will actually produce value within the business. And this is, I think we can all agree, or hopefully, but we're all huge AI optimists. So I think we can all agree that like in the fullness of time, AI is going to transform every single major industry. There will be no industry or no sector that is left untouched by AI. But in the meantime, the sort of like absorption or diffraction of AI through the corporate world or through all of these traditional industries is going to be based off of like, you know, to my point, where is the sort of intervention or the surgery the lightest? I think that actually biases towards industries that already have, for one reason or another, have large amounts of digital data, as well as large amounts of things that already happen mostly digitally. And so financial services or fintech is one of them. I think Marty even talked about a lot of, you know, sort of like frankly old school use cases of where AI and machine learning have already been impacting financial services and fintech. I think another really big one is retail and e-commerce. And this is structurally because in the past, especially over the past year, you know, there's this acceleration from traditional retail, which is in person, towards e-commerce. And then as you accelerate towards e-commerce, most of the things that happen are purely digital in nature. You know, they purely happen on machines. And as that's happening, you have this opportunity to layer in and utilize AI and machine learning, just in the same way that the past generation of tech companies was able to layer in AI and machine learning onto ads. And so I think there's this big opportunity for retail and e-commerce to pretty meaningfully transform themselves with AI and machine learning, especially as the world is sort of like double whammy accelerating towards e-commerce in the first place. And then there's a bunch more sectors where they already have large amounts of digital data, which you can operate on top of. I think logistics is an interesting one. Pharmaceuticals is certainly interesting per Marty's conversation, et cetera. But then there's this whole other class, which is areas where there is a necessity to innovate in AI. And so Scale, we got started in the autonomous vehicle and the self-driving industry. And part of the reason that industry moved so quickly was because there's a real necessity to innovate, a real necessity to implement AI into AI and machine learning for autonomous driving, for driver assistance into all of our vehicles and all of our automobiles. You know, I think one really critical area that stands out to me as an area where AI is for reasons of necessity is going to have to change things is in the government and for national security. You know, the government, we currently have all of our eyes on China as our main competitor, and China has proven an incredible capability of integrating technology and innovation into their national security enterprise and into how they govern their society. When it comes to national security, the battlefield has shifted from the physical front line to a digital one, and one that is primarily waged on AI, cyber, et cetera. And so I don't think it's easy to perform surgery on how we operate as a government and as a country. I think it's probably, frankly, from a ease perspective, one of the more difficult places for us to utilize AI. But I think it's an absolute necessity right now. And so I think it's imperative that, you know, as a country, we integrate AI into everything that we do as quickly as possible from a national security perspective to remain competitive. And so I'm very excited and bullish about that use case. Not because it's going to be easy, but because it's necessary.
And what do you think, Anima?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like kind of doubling down on weather and climate, right? So it's going to fundamentally change how we are doing it today, because we have this really expensive numerical models that, you know, are also, right, having modeling errors. And it's very hard to model cloud cover, especially if you think about precipitation and the microphysics that's involved there and the long-term change that comes about by, right, like the precision of these models. So I think machine learning has a lot of potential to do this multi-scale modeling. You know, a lot of work we are doing has been in the realm of partial differential equations. How do we capture such fluid turbulence using machine learning based models, right, without necessarily kind of having to do like fine scale discretization like traditional models do, and hence get even up to 1 million times speed up over traditional methods. And so I think we'll fundamentally see a shift in how we can like gather all of world's data, right? I mean, right now there's a weather model, there's a climate model, and they don't agree with each other. At some point weather becomes climate, right? But we don't have a common model for that. The energy atlas of this country, we don't have a common energy atlas of all different sources of energy. Where are the grids? What are the vulnerabilities if there are extreme weather? We don't have an answer to that, right? So ultimately what we want is a twin Earth, right? Like all different phenomena of this planet, can we bring that into the simulation, into the metaverse? And so that's where NVIDIA has announced Earth 2 as the supercomputer to make all this happen and to really, catalyze the research in this direction. So I'm very excited about that. I'm also excited about the healthcare domain, to Marty's point about like the pharma industry. One of the startups, NTOS, is based on the research we did at Caltech, where we go all the way down to the quantum mechanical properties and calculating that with AI, right? And so that precise calculations could help us search much more effectively in the space of all molecules to pick the right ones. So I think, and we've also seen the impact of that in understanding how the COVID-19 virus interacts in the aerosol and kind of, right, how does it survive in the mucin and like kind of interacts with the cells of our body. So I think having like a billion atom simulation like this would have been unheard of even few years ago. So it's both like, accelerated computing augmented by AI that has made it possible to do this extreme scale as well as multi-scale simulations.
Sorry, I meant to give you a shout out. The supercomputer that Recursion uses is an NVIDIA supercomputer.
Yes, of course.
BioHive 1, and for probably 1 minute, it's number 58 on the global list. But thank you for that.
And we're very happy that, Chris Gibson and the Recursion team are so bullish on GPUs, and they are being pioneers in using it in that sector. I did visit their your company in Utah and Salt Lake City, and
you can imagine the board discussion when they wanted us to agree to actually buy one. Like, can't you just rent that at Google? But yeah, we're glad we did. It's working out amazing.
Yes, indeed. So I think, there's lots of industries like that, but ultimately I would say that the fundamental scientific method itself will see a change, right? Because right now there's a lot of human intuition on what hypothesis do we even select, right? And then what experiments do we do? How do we validate it and then go back all the way again? So if we can speed all that up and kind of bring intuition into machine learning, we've seen that with a lot of great examples for reinforcement learning, including the protein folding and all the game playing examples. So I think a lot of scientific disciplines where we augment human intuition with AI will see a fundamental change. The other one, which is overhyped, is I really wish it to be a reality, but we are not going to see a robotic dog anytime soon. My partner is like, oh, it's going to be too much work to have a pet dog, just invent a robotic dog, and then you can put it in the closet when we travel, so we don't have to worry about it. So probably not happening in my lifetime. And I think dogs are just too cute. We can't replace them.
I love that one. I think last question, we have time for one more. This wouldn't be a New Year panel if we didn't ask for predictions. So let's close it out. I'm curious to hear, what predictions do you have for AI over the next decade? And maybe Alex, we'll start with you.
I think one major trend, you even heard both Anima and Marty talk about it today, is AI and machine learning impacting science and totally changing how we do science. I think that is like everything that that Anima was talking about is incredibly exciting. Basically that we've been one way to think about where the bottlenecks we've been in science. I think there's been, for example, there have been these papers that have talked about how is science progress slowing down, and I think that there is some reality to that, because basically the way to think about it is that there's a certain space of ideas that humans can computationally sort of explore, and then we've basically hit the limits of that. Then there's like another space where humans plus computers can explore. They kind of hit the limits of that, and then now we're going to enter this realm where like it's humans plus computers with AI, and now we can explore a significantly broader range of concepts and ideas than we could have in the past. And another way to think about it is like in science, experiments are very, very expensive generally, especially large scale experiments. In physics, for example, to build one of these accelerators, it costs tens of billions of dollars or whatnot, or potentially $100 billion. In pharmaceuticals, these trials are extremely expensive, hundreds of millions of dollars for a phase 3 trial. And so a lot of these experiments are incredibly expensive. But if you're able to, utilizing AI, see this 1,000,000x speed up in what machines are able to do, it totally changes. It basically means that, like, if humans had like a certain level of scientific ability, let's say we're standing on the shoulders of giants, now we're going to be standing on the shoulders of a skyscraper, looking around and seeing, what are all the different ideas to explore, what are all the different scientific concepts. And so I think that's it's an extremely embedded and very exciting, like, underlying theme that is going to unleash a huge amount of innovation and a huge amount of really exciting technology over the course of the next, not only decade, but like many decades. And so I think that structurally is like maybe one of the ones to focus on. I think the other ones are, I think that, like, obviously every industry is going to be transformed with AI. At this point, we all know that. I do think that the government use of AI is going to be incredibly critical for defending democracy over the course of the next decade. I really think that, the Secretary of Defense, Austin Lloyd, recently gave a presentation at the Reagan National Defense Forum, where he talked about how innovation, and in particular partnering with innovative companies and technology companies, is going to be really critical for the United States strategy in competing with China. I think that is definitely true. And I think that over the course of the next decade, the focus on AI and machine learning is only going to increase, and frankly needs to be a lot higher than it even is today. And then, the last piece, if we think about the next gen consumer experiences, so there's obviously been a lot of talk around metaverse and what does metaverse even mean, and how does crypto integrate with that, et cetera. But I think that, it feels very certain that the next gen consumer experiences are going to be critically enabled with AI. And so if you think about augmented reality, for example, which is one version of the metaverse that we think about, or some sort of like embodied avatar experience, either in VR or AR, I think that maybe one of the things that's not so obvious to everybody who talks about it is that one of the biggest roadblocks to accomplishing that is actually AI. The metaverse is actually an AI problem at its core, because we don't yet have algorithms which can do the kind of perception that you need to do. We don't have an algorithm where you can walk into a room that you haven't been in and understand all the objects inside of it, and understand how you could overlay digital objects on top of it. We don't have AI to understand sort of like humans and all their actions and how those actions interact with these digital objects that you want to overlay. And there's a lot just in terms of us being understand the real world or the physical world that needs to happen before you can have sort of these convincing metaverse concepts. And then if you think about how crypto, which one version of that is enabling frictionless capitalism, if you think about integrating frictionless capitalism into these systems, then similarly you need an even deeper understanding of how these transactions, or how the capitalistic activities interact with the real world, which again is going to be an AI and machine learning problem. And so I think that from all of our lives, I think our next generation of consumer experiences are going to be enabled through AI, whether that's kind of a lo-fi use case or a lo-fi experience. Like, for example, I think a lot of us are going to have a sort of a chatbot friend in the not so distant future that just talks to us when we're feeling lonely and we like have problems that we need to vent to someone about. I think AI is going to be like really well suited to solve that lo-fi use case, all the way to hi-fi use cases like AR. I think these are all going to need to be enabled through artificial intelligence. And so I think there's a lot to be excited about. I think as going to be the pillar of sort of like the next decade of foreign policy and how all of our countries interact with one another. It's going to be the core of consumer experiences, and it's going to be at the core of science. And so I think there's no better time to be in the world of AI than now.
Anima, predictions.
Yeah, I think, doubling down on climate and environmental risks. I think in the next decade, broadly, we will have, right, countries like trying to build a coalition or trying to come up into agreements of what to do to reduce emissions. This is so important. And right now there is a lot of, the carbon markets are still too early. And in fact, I saw a statistic that 97% of them actually do not reduce emissions, right? So building the right economic framework and using, I guess, machine learning to have like kind of prediction markets and have, right, the ability to kind of, right, understand where the biggest impact would come from, which policies, right? Like, you know, if we had the twin Earths, then we can run a lot of what if scenarios, right? Where are the biggest risks? What are the extreme events? And which governments and which companies can contribute the most to mitigating those, as well as new technologies such as for carbon dioxide sequestration, right? Whether it's capturing into materials, you know, having like cement, right, where there is carbon capture, to storing carbon dioxide deep underground. How do we model like the pressure buildup and the risks that go with it? So I think all those new technologies, right, will be using machine learning in some form or the other. And so that's where I see, like, you know, we need to do this yesterday, but now I think we are in a good place to, right, not just use machine learning, but to really build this, right, like twin Earth and a holistic view of all the information together. You know, without that, we wouldn't be able to make global level decisions on what is the right strategy for this planet.
We're going to need you to build that infrastructure that we can do systems level AI modeling. So we're looking at you. Okay, last but not least, Marty, what are your predictions?
Well, like Anima, I've been fascinated my whole life with this concept of building digital twins, and everything I've done has really fit within that rubric. And so here's my prediction. After having built a digital twin of human cells, tissues, organs, bodies, communities, that is of such high fidelity, we will have the first personal, tailored medicine that's generated on the spot, synthesized on the spot for a particular patient. No clinical trials necessary, because we will already have gathered all the data that we need, and the rest can be done digitally. It's a crazy.
I love it. That's a bold one. Great note to end on. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation, and looking forward to seeing you at the next session.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Erin.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.